So welcome everyone to this session of the Affirmation International Conference. Very interesting topic of the evolution of LGBTQ Latter-day Saint theology. My name is Joel McDonald. I'm the Director of Operations here at Affirmation and your host for this session. But our presenters are the illustrious Bill Bradshaw and Bob Rees. Bill Bradshaw is a professor emeritus at the Department of Microbiology and Molecular Biology at Brigham Young University. His research interests include developmental biology, regulation of gene expression, science education, and most recently, the experience of LGBTQ Mormons. He served with his wife Marjorie as president of the LDS mission in Hong Kong and South Vietnam from 1971 to 1974. They were also co-chairs for 4 years of the LDS Family Fellowship, a support group for parents of LGBTQ children. We also have Bob Rees with us, who is professor and director of Mormon studies at the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley. He's been engaged in Latter-day Saint LGBTQ issues for 50 years, including giving keynote addresses at 3 Affirmation National Conferences. He is the author and co-author of various publications, including Supportive Families, Healthy Children, Helping Latter-day Saint Families with Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, and Transgender Children, LGBTQ Latter-day Saint Theology, and Requiem for a Gay Mormon. So welcome to both Bill and Bob for what I am sure will be an enlightening session.
Thank you so much, Joel. I must say at the beginning how delighted I am to be on this session with my dear friend, Bill Bradshaw, who's pioneering work in the field of LGBT science has both enlightened me and blessed countless numbers of Latter-day Saints. I teach at a theological university. It's a wonderful experience. My students are studying for the ministry. They're Buddhists and Muslims and Jews and Catholics and evangelicals and people of all stripes and all theologies. And so it's very interesting for me to have an opportunity to teach Latter-day Saint religion to people who are studying theology. I grew up in a church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, that didn't believe in theology. We certainly, 50 years ago, for a Latter-day Saint to be teaching at a theological university might have been considered heretical. James Falconer, an LDS a theologian, argues, quote, Latter-day Saints are atheological, that is, without a philosophy that explains and gives rational support to their beliefs and teachings. The church neither has an official theology, explicit or implicit, nor encourages theological speculation. One might say that's both good news and bad news. The good news is that it leaves us open to developing a theology. The bad news is that we have traditionally had no theological structure on which to construct a theology, even though when it gets down to it, the Mormonism, I consider when I teach my students, I say that Mormonism has a radical theology, a radical cosmology, and a radical metaphysics. We also have an open canon, which means that we have living prophets and the possibilities, infinite possibilities of God speaking to those prophets. Because we believe in continuing revelation, we recognize that things are open, unsettled, and possible. So our theology begins with what it means to have being. Who are we? Where did we come from? Why are we here? Where are we going? And there is one of the ideas that is radical within the field of theology, is that we had a pre-existence, that as all of us existed before we came to this earth. And one of the great things of Mormon theology that I often remind people of when they are condemning of gays or lesbians or others, or just any others, is that every person in mortality kept their first estate. Every person raised their hand in the pre-existence and said, I'll take the risk of going into mortality. So whatever happened in the preexistence, and we don't know much about it, we do know that it was a school to bring us into this mortal world and to give us an opportunity to learn and to grow, to develop, to evolve spiritually. And so mortality is a kind of school for us to learn how, in Latter-day Saint theology, to become like God or like gods. And if we learn that well enough, or even if we don't, there is such a thing as the post-mortal world, in which we enter into immortality and or eternal life. And there are many things about that in terms of our degrees of heaven, in terms of the idea that we are gods in embryo, in terms of the idea of our having the possibility of having the ultimate power of godhood. But contrary to what many Latter-day Saints assume, there are more things that are unclear and unsettled about the post-existence than there are clear and settled. That is, you see, it's not unusual to meet Latter-day Saints who have it all completely figured out, and we're just following the plan. The plan is specific and concrete, and we can let everybody know that we have it. So those principles that govern Latter-day Saint theology are really important in terms of trying to understand what we have in terms of a theology of LGBTQ individuals and where we are in that theology. One thing that is clear, if one studies the history of Latter-day Saint theology, is that we have an evolved and a continual evolving theology. The last word is not in. The first word has changed, and there's been a lot of changes and evolving in the process. So what the future holds, I would say, is unclear. There are certain things that are clear, but a lot of things that are not unclear. So as we say in the conclusion to our essay, our article, whatever one might say about LGBT Latter-day Saint theology as it evolved over the years, what seems clear is that by and large, the evolution of that theology has been slow and painful, and it's been marked more by intransigence, inflexibility, and an adamantine insistence on institutional rightness than on a willingness to consider the possibility of error, a passionate quest for enlightenment, or an open or alternative position, policies, and practices. I'll be 85 in a month or so, so I've lived long enough to live through this evolution. I can remember being a student at BYU in the 50s and early 60s when nobody even talked about these things. I can remember being on a mission where if there was a missionary who was identified as gay or lesbian, more often than not, the language or the actions toward that person would have been unchristian by his or her fellow missionaries. Most of all, along the somewhat errant and tortuous path towards a more enlightened LGBT theology, Latter-day Saints seem to have forgotten that theology involves the study of God and his relationship to humanity. Such study leads to the inevitable and ultimate conclusion that any theology worth our consideration must be based on love. That's something I think the evolution of Mormon theology has been slow to recognize. We have a lot of ideas and theories, but many of them have not included love. So charity, which the Moroni describes as the pure love of Christ, is what any theology of anything ought to be based on. So the scope and seriousness of the issues relating to LGBT individuals demand a new theology based on love. And that's part of what I think motivated Bill and me to do the thing that we're doing and trying to understand and articulate that philosophy. Latter-day Saint philosopher and theologian Adam Miller argues this: human suffering from blunt trauma to quiet desperation is, and both of those describe, I think, the trauma of Latter-day Saint LGBT people and their families. So I'll say that again. Human suffering from blunt trauma to quiet desperation is the perpetual crisis that precipitates theology. And then I would say the suffering of LGBT Latter-day Saints and their families over the past 70 years should precipitate such a theology for the future, one based on charity. As Miller brilliantly posits, charity decides the span of theology. Theology is worth only as much charity as it is able to show. It is the specificity of this task that distinguishes it. Though intertwined with history, doctrine, and devotion, theology is for the sake of charity. I feel that is so important. Theology is for the sake of charity. This is confirmed by Latter-day Saint scholar Terrell Givens, who posits that faith, hope, and love constitute, quote, the foundation for theology, community, and destiny, unquote. The good news is that such charity, such love, is central to Latter-day Saint theology, as taught in the Gospels, the Book of Mormon, and Latter-day Saint scriptures. As the Doctrine and Covenant states, no power or influence, and I think that is influenced by anyone, even though this is specifically about the priesthood, can or ought to be maintained by virtue of the priesthood only by persuasion, by long-suffering, by gentleness, by meekness, and by love unfeigned, by kindness and pure knowledge, shall greatly enlarge the soul without hypocrisy and without guile, showing forth an increase of love. If we had followed that revelation given to Prophet Joseph Smith over the past 150 years in relation to LGBT issues, we would not be having the difficulty we have had, because we would have been doing what we did with long-suffering, gentleness, meekness, kindness, and showing forth an increase of love. So, as the concluding prophet in the Book of Mormon pleads, wherefore, my beloved brethren, pray unto the Father with all the energy of your heart and soul, that you may be filled with this love which he hath bestowed upon all who are true followers of his Son, Jesus Christ. That is the structure, the foundation on which any Latter-day Saint theology, certainly a theology relating to LGBT individuals, should be constructed. And I now turn the time over to Bill Bradshaw, whose work has been such a blessing to this discussion and to the evolution of this theology, and has helped contribute to the bringing into our discussion science. We're in an age where science is not honored as it should be, and we pay a price for that whenever we ignore science. And we are blessed within our community to have a scientist of Bill's not only stature as a scientist, but his great charity as a human being.
Thank you, Bob. I am moved by the kindness of your soul and honored to be with you. I want to start with this important idea. The concept of homosexuality is brand new in human history. That is to say, the notion that there is a minority proportion of the human family who is by nature different than the majority with regard to sexual attraction is an idea that is very, very recent. So for most of human history, people in most cultures have assumed that there is only one class of human beings, heterosexuals, females who are sexually attracted to males, and men who are sexually attracted to women. So with regard to LDS religious teachings, let's consider what that means in terms of religious ideas that we have perpetuated from the Bible. So there are three of these. There is the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. There are the strong prohibitions of Leviticus, and there are the teachings of Paul. In all cases, I'm going to assert people who made these declarations in the scriptures were aware of same-sex sex, but not same-sex orientation. Now, the story of Sodom is a special case. It really has nothing to do with sex at all. In fact, the people of Sodom are condemned not because of anything sexual, but because they were unwelcoming to strangers. That's clear from the text itself. It's clear from the historical context. It wasn't until a few years after Christ that it was even assumed that the people of Sodom were condemned because of some sexual impropriety. So I assert again that in Leviticus, and especially in the teachings of Paul, it's clear that same-sex sex was proclaimed as wrongful because it was contrary to human nature. Paul says, don't do things that are against your nature. Stephen Jay Gould was an extremely competent scientific writer who followed the history of scientific ideas, especially evolution. And he offers a very important idea, which is that in politics, incumbency is very important. But in the history of ideas, incumbency likewise has great staying power. So it wasn't until 1869 that there was even a word for the concept of homosexuality, non-heterosexuality, as a reality in the human condition. And it wasn't until 1895 that the word appeared in English. So this notion that there were only heterosexual people has persisted throughout LDS doctrine and LDS attitudes, up through and including LDS leaders like Spencer Kimball and Mark Peterson. When was there any evidence, in fact, that there were people who were by nature same-sex attracted? It wasn't until around 50 years ago that there was any laboratory evidence that this might be true. And so if you look at pronouncements in LDS literature, especially those that appeared in LDS social science, social services, now LDS family services, it was clear that dealing with people who were not heterosexual was based on altering their feelings and their attitudes, restoring them to normal being heterosexual. So the ideas upon which that was based were Freudian and gave rise to things like a young boy is not really gay, but thinks he might be gay because he had an unloving relationship with his father. His dad wouldn't go out in the backyard and play catch with him. And his mother, in order to compensate, was overbearing. And in this way, the boy did not develop normal sexual feelings towards girls and women as an adult. In 1991, an important paper appeared in the journal Science by Simon LeVay. It offered evidence that, in fact, the brains of gay men were different than those of heterosexual men. And that important paper prompted a sort of change in LDS statements. So instead of totally disregarding a possible biological origin for people who are same-sex attracted, the statements out of the church began to find fault with the scientific evidence, criticizing its methodology and finding its conclusions inadequate. But the evidence has continued to accumulate, and it is very clear today that the evidence is overwhelming that there is a biological origin for sexual orientation, both straight and gay. That during embryological development, people's brains are programmed either to be straight or gay. And although the mechanisms, the complete story of the mechanisms for this has not been fully developed, the evidence that it exists is overwhelming. And the notion that homosexuality has a psychological, a sociological evidence, explanation after people are born is lacking. It's not hard to find in pronouncements of Latter-day Saints the notion that we accept truth from all sources. It doesn't matter where the truth comes from, we accept it all. It's also clear that with regard to certain issues, there's a selective acceptance, especially of secular inquiry and empirical science. So all truth is equal, but it turns out that some truths are more equal than others. Let me cite an example from a conference talk in October of 2018, whose primary objective was to denigrate same-sex relationships. Quote, "When we seek the truth about religion, we should use spiritual methods appropriate for that search: prayer, the witness of the Holy Ghost, and the study of the scriptures and the words of modern prophets. The methods of science lead us to what we call scientific truth, but scientific truth is not the whole of life. We find true and enduring joy by coming to know and acting upon the truth about who we are and the meaning of mortal life and where we are going when we die. These truths cannot be learned by scientific or secular methods." I'd just like to point out that there are two omissions in this statement. One of the omissions is that we should recognize that spiritual means are not capable of answering all of our important questions. In spite of our happiness with what we have been taught by revelation. Most of what God knows, he has not told us. Spiritual means are very important in our lives, but there are some questions that we don't know the answers to. And the second omission is that while secular science cannot address all of our important issues, they can address many of them. And it's improper for us to disregard, to disbelieve, to cast aside what is very clear from scientific inquiry. We do so at our peril. And my concluding thought then is, as I'm getting close to the time when I'm not going to be here in this mortal life, there's a whole lot of things that I'd like to know about what comes in the life to come. And I think that as Latter-day Saints, we need to admit that we don't know the answers. Greg Prince asks an important question to illustrate our ignorance about the relationships that are going to exist when we pass into the life to come. His question is, where do you go for Thanksgiving dinner? In the absence of our understanding about most of what is going to happen to us when we pass into the next realm, my view is that we should accept humbly that ignorance. And with regard to our gay and lesbian brothers and sisters, I'll end on the same note as Bob has. The answer is that we should love one another and do everything in our power to extend equality and the best of all opportunities to all of our Heavenly Father's children, regardless of their sexual orientation.
Thank you, Bill.
Thanks.
Thank you, Bill. And I should have said at the beginning, if you have, you're welcome to put questions in to the chat. And we'll also, I think, open it up to, just open it up to you. I don't know how many people we have here, but we have a lot. And I can't see most people's hands, but there is a way to raise, I think, some kind of a electronic hand. One of the questions that came up in the chat was, where can you get a copy of Bill's and my piece? It is on, I'll ask Joel if he would post it. It was recently published on the Dialogue website. So if you go to dialogue.org and, or is it com? I can't remember. And type in Dialogue, just type in Dialogue Journal and type in Bill's and my name, it ought to come up. But we'll try and post it. So if you have questions to ask of either Bill or me, and I can see your face, most of you, I just see your names, not your face, but if you want to join with this and raise your hand or whatever, we'll try and answer your questions. The other thing I would say is that Bill and I have both published a number of articles and essays on this subject, and I really recommend Bill's pamphlets to you because I think they are extremely important in this dialogue. That is, we have moved from a point where no one talked about homosexuality, or very few people did, to a point when people talked about it, but didn't know what to do about it. This was in the 30s and 40s. And then when the church appointed two apostles to be in charge of this question when it started becoming much more within the public discourse, then the whole dialogue began to shift, and it shifted in, I think, both a dramatic and a dramatically unfortunate way, so that homosexuality became seen as this horrible and detestable sin against nature, against God, against humanity. And that dark place from which we were, the dark pit from which homosexuality was thrust, had to work its way out of that darkness. And that took more than half a century for this kind of slow evolution from that place where it was very dangerous to be gay. It still is. And in many countries of the world, to be gay or transsexual is not possible to openly because of danger, but it's even dangerous in American society, and it's dangerous in Latter-day Saint culture. So we are not where we should be, but we're a much better place than we were. So now I see there are some questions in the chat box. I answer the one about where you can get the presentation. David Anderson says, what would need to change doctrinally for the church to accept same-sex marriage? Wow, get right to it. Yeah, that is the golden question in a sense. Bill, would you like to tackle that while I think about it?
Well, I think the answer is nothing would have to change doctrinally except our ignorance. We say the statements that have been made, in my opinion, claim a knowledge that we don't have. Just think about people that you know and care about, and you will find that there are a lot of earthly relationships that are very complicated, and we're all glad that we're not going to be in charge of deciding who goes with whom, and we leave that to Heavenly Father. What we do know is very clear. Let's love one another without exception and bring equality to everybody, and just admit to ignorance about what many of life's most important questions, the answers to those questions are.
I think it's one of the great ironies in Latter-day Saint culture that from the time we are in primary, old enough to even understand this, we are told our most important task is to find somebody to be our companion, to fall in love with that person, to make a relationship, and to form that bond, because it is in a recognition that the bonding with another person is one of the ways in which our heavenly parents have designed for us to grow. And so then you get to be 8 or 9 or 10 or 11 or however old you are. It's earlier now than it used to be because it's much safer to be open. You realize that the person that you have fallen in love with, or the person to whom you are attracted, the person that you love, does not fit within the category of accepted couples. And so you are torn, you're faced this dilemma of being celibate in soul, that is S-O-L-E, or of finding somebody and marrying them. And what has happened, is a number of LGBT Latter-day Saints who, when I was bishop of a singles congregation in Los Angeles many, many years ago, I delivered a sacrament meeting talk called No More Strangers and Foreigners, a Latter-day Saint attitude toward homosexuality. because within my ward, there were a number of people who, finding that this was a loving and acceptable congregation, were coming from all over Los Angeles and further than that to attend church because they wanted to be in church. They loved the church. They loved the Latter-day Saint community. And many of them felt estranged from the very community to which they had given their devotion, sometimes an immense devotion of sacrifice and service, missions, many kinds of devotion. And then being told that they couldn't be part of that. And our position in that Los Angeles First Ward was that everybody was welcome and should be treated equally, because we quote and are quoting more frequently these days, all are likened to God, male, female, black, white, Jew and Gentile, slave and master. But you take that to its next degrees, all are likened to God, gay and straight and transgender. All are likened to God. God makes no distinction in terms of his or her love, in terms of that, and to find that the thing that the science taught us is that this really destructive idea that you chose your orientation and you could change it, caused us to lose so many wonderful Latter-day Saints to either estrangement from the church or to suicide, and that to me is one of the great tragedies of the modern church, is that very destructive idea that you chose it and you could change it. And it was very clear to me from the gay and lesbian and transsexual members of my congregation taught me that wasn't true, and I knew it wasn't from their experience. So you have this irony. In fact, let me tell you just a brief anecdote of I have a good friend who is a Sacred Relief Society president in Seattle, and once the Proposition 8 was passed, some members of her congregation who had not come, but she knew them, knew that they could get married now by the Constitution, and they got married, and they said to her, "Can we come to church?" And I wrote to the stake president and said, here are people who are living the gospel in every regard except for one thing. They are not, they've chosen a form of marriage which is not acceptable. And are they welcome into your congregations? And the answer was yes. But then later, the answer was no in that stake and other stakes, that these people who were many times returned missionaries, full tithe payers, wonderful fathers and mothers, living every tenet of the gospel and living it to an extreme degree of righteousness, were not welcomed into a congregation. That seems to me so fundamentally wrong. A long way of answering that question, which is probably not a satisfactory answer, is a few things would have to change. And my argument is that whatever governs the eternal worlds, we know what governs mortality. We know that children raised by gay parents are just as developed, just as healthily, morally, and emotionally, and other ways, as raised by straight parents, by opposite sex marriage couples. So to acknowledge and accept gay marriage for mortality, it seemed to me, would be an important step forward. What this would take would be a change among the leading brethren of the church to do that. But I think the argument in terms of the people who are living those lives is, I find, very compelling. It says, thanks for these responses. It seems that being candid about what we don't know is very hard for the institutional church. Has it always been this way? My field is American literature, and someone who was, the story is told that someone I was having a conversation with Thoreau, and the person was so insistent on being right. Thoreau said it was so Mormon-like. And there is a great danger in our being so certain. In fact, there's a wonderful book by Peter Enns that I recommend to everyone. It's called The Sin of Certainty. We are so certain about so many things about which there is not certainty, as Bill wonderfully said. Bill, why don't you say something about this? It's hard for the institutional church to acknowledge what it doesn't know. It's even harder for the institutional church to apologize when it has made mistakes. Bill?
Well, I just want to say, if you want to evaluate the appropriateness of a same-sex relationship, don't do it theoretically and quote some doctrinal notion. Go into that home, visit with the family, see what kind of people they are, see if they get up in the middle of the night to care for their spouse who is ill, see if they're good citizens, see how they act as coaches on their little league, the little league baseball teams of their kids, see if they're good citizens, see what kind of employees they are, and they're all just as good or better than you are. That's the way we ought to do it, and that's how I think it's going to be. If after we die we find out that being gay and lesbian is a circumstance that's unique to mortality, then we'll adjust to that. When we find out the answer to these questions, we'll accept it and we'll go on, but we won't change in the way that we love one
another. I see the faces of some people out there that I know and love and whose stories I know. My heart is deeply touched by the devotion of Latter-day Saints who have faced this challenge. One of the essays I wrote was called Finding Christ at St. Thomas Episcopal Church. When I was a bishop, or after I had been a bishop, one of the people who came to my congregation from outside the ward invited me to go to his church. And this is one of the things that I think is tragic, is that Latter-day Saint LGBT people who leave the church very often do not find a spiritual home in another church. And this particular man had, it served a wonderful mission. He came from a multi-generation of what I would call Mormon nobility, and was a really accomplished actor. And he invited me to come to church. And when I went to church in the North Hollywood Catholic Episcopal Church, St. Thomas, I found that the organ in that church had been built by a returned Latter-day Saint missionary. The organist that day was a returned Latter-day Saint missionary. The head of the lay ministry of that church was a returned Latter-day Saint missionary. There were 5 of them. And after this church service, we went to lunch, and I heard their stories, and all of them wanted to be in a Latter-day Saint service, but didn't feel welcome there. And I saw that and see it as one of the great failures of our religion, that we have not welcomed people into our congregations, no matter what. And so I think that is the beginning. There are Latter-day Saints who are in married relationships and who are accepted in their congregations. It doesn't happen very often. But one of the ironies is that in every ward that I've been in, there have been cohabiting heterosexuals. And they are welcome to church. Their children come to primary. Their children go to young men and young women. They sing in the choir. They are welcomed when gay and lesbian couples who are married in same-sex marriages are not welcomed, and their children are not welcome. And this again seems to me to be fundamentally wrong and contrary to what the New Testament and the Book of Mormon teach us.
I have to believe that our Heavenly Father holds out great blessings to our gay brothers and sisters in the life to come, given how wonderfully moral and good they live their lives in spite of the kind of challenges that you've just described, Bob, both in and out of Mormondom.
The most hopeful scripture in the Book of Mormon is the one in Nephi, where it says, the Holy One of Israel is the keeper of the gate, and he has appointed no other servant there. The only person we have to be accountable to ultimately, according to what Nephi says, is Christ. If we live our lives in honor of who he is and his teachings, then I think whatever happens within our culture and within our time, I think that we will find ourselves embraced at that gate. Joel, how much time do we have?
So the session is scheduled to end at 1:10. So
Okay, so do we have any other questions? Any other things that anyone wants to ask or say? You're all welcome to say something if you want to unmute yourself and ask a question. I was pleased to see that there is a new task force in Utah has recently been doing some advanced things in terms of addressing suicide among people. Utah has ranked in the top 5 in the nation in suicide over a number of years. This is, again, something I think that condemns us. Okay, so here's a question from Devon. What is the most significant change in the church's stance on LGBTQ issues that you have observed? Bill, you want to answer that? What is the most significant change?
In the Oakes-Wickman statement issued by LDS Public Affairs, they say that the question of the origin of homosexuality is not addressed in the church. So one of the changes that we have observed over time is a willingness to acknowledge that we don't know the answers to the question of origins. That has certainly helped to some degree.
I think for me, the most, 2 things. One is the change from you chose this and you can change it. That to me was huge. The other was the message to parents. You know, Caitlin Ryan and I published this guide for the parents of LGBT children. And in that work that Caitlin did, she's just a wonderful researcher. She showed that if a parent simply said, I don't understand this, I don't like it, but you're my child and nothing will change my love for you, that is enough to significantly decrease a child's suicide ideology or attempt at suicide. Just to say, I accept you as my child and I love you. I went through this period, as some of you have, as I see out there, where LGBT people were rejected by their parents. and were told by their bishops and their stake presidents that they were living in sin and that they were going against God, and that the parents were disappointed in them because they would have no place with them in the next life. All of those horrible and horribly wrong teachings that we insisted on for so long, that kind of destructiveness, fortunately, much of it has disappeared, not all of it. For me, the test when people say, well, what should I do? And I said, I'm going to ask you a question. This is in the coming sacrament meeting. If you're sitting in sacrament meeting and someone comes in and sits down next to you who has a beard and a skirt, what would your response be? Would you introduce yourself and welcome that person to the ward and invite them to dinner afterwards, or would you move over or get up and move to another pew? We all are born wanting love. We all spend a good deal of our lives trying to get love, and we all die without having gotten enough. So
someone just asked about the church's proclamation that gender is a binary condition that's eternal.
Go ahead, Bill.
I just think that's wrong. And I think we have to hold out the possibility that's one of the notions that's been proclaimed that doesn't have a basis in what we can rely on. I think we should also mention among the church's changes their willingness to support the Utah law that prohibits reparative therapy for persons under the age of 18. That represents a change in the church's official position.
So this other question, do you think there will ever be hope for the church to recognize holy unions or domestic partnerships as legitimate legal relationships between two monogamous LGBTQ church members? Temple marriage, I assume, would be out of the question. I would assume this as well. The church at one time recognized and honored common law marriages. And I mentioned the fact that many, in every ward congregation, there are cohabiting heterosexuals who are accepted into the congregation. So I'm hoping that would be the case. Someone said, looks like Peter has his hands up. Peter, unmute yourself and ask your question.
Sure, thanks. So my question, I've had some discussions with family members recently, and something that became clear to me in that discussion is I'm trying to, figure out this whole theology thing and try to, find some balance in my understanding and the things that we don't know in the church, and finding some space in my brain for how to accept my sexual orientation, but also to, hold on to the strong faith that I have in the gospel of Jesus Christ, and putting that together. And as I've talked to some of my family members, I realized that there was a disconnect there in this understanding of my orientation or not being a part of my eternal identity, rather than being a condition of mortality that needs to be waded through, and kind of endured, and then it'll go away and everything will go back to normal. And so my trying to figure things out and piece together the things that we know and what we don't know, and try to fit myself into that understanding comes across as radical, like I'm trying to change things or throw a spin in the mix. Whereas for me, it's more of this is how I'm preserving my faith and trying to figure out how to move forward and connect with God and with Jesus Christ. And I'm struggling to know how to talk to my family about those things without really about anything when they lack that. We have that difference in opinion and understanding of where this comes from, or its eternal nature, and how to approach that, and to help, whether that's help them understand or Do I just avoid the topic, or I'm struggling with that? That's not a very clear question, but I'm looking for some thoughts.
I would hope, Peter, that you make room in your heart as well as your mind for understanding who you are, and I'm sure you do. Bill, do you want to address that at all?
Well, I've never met you, Peter. I love you for your sweet spirit. I can only say, be patient. The experience of quite a number of gay and lesbian people whom I love is that with a little time, parents come around, siblings come around. It's not always true, but when people have a personal relationship with an LGBTQ person whom they love, and they can appreciate the moral goodness and the equal goodness of that individual, hearts can be changed. Hang in there, Peter.
And we just have a couple of more minutes. If you've lived as long as I have, you've seen the church evolve on a number of issues. One that I think might be instructive for LGBT people is what happened, to look at the history of race and the church, that we have come a very long way. We had to come a very long way. We've come quite a ways on this issue. We have a long ways to go. I could not, in my heart and in my spirit, make any sense of the 2015 proclamation or doctrinal pronouncement about LGBT parents and their children. That made no sense to me in any understanding of the gospel. And I'm happy that that has changed, but I'm sorry for the destructive nature, the destruction that it had. I would come back in the minute that we have together to say, I think the Lord also hopes for you to love the church even when it doesn't love you. I think this is the great question for Christians, great question of Christ on the cross, who loved all of humanity, even those who were nailing him to the cross. Your parents who don't understand and the leaders who don't understand you also need love. It may be impossible for you to love them, or certainly is unjust for you to be asked to do that. But love yourself. That commandment is embedded in the first two great commandments: to love the Lord and to love your neighbor as yourself. Love yourself and love whatever else you are capable of loving, including those who do not love you. And I believe that God will bless you and embrace you, that your heavenly parents will rejoice over your goodness, which I sense even over this electronic distance. Thank you so much for coming. Bill and I both are available to have you correspond with us or ask us questions or to read our material. We are not through yet with this question because we are deeply committed to trying to find better answers than we have at this point.
Well, thank you so much to both Bob and Bill for this amazing presentation and for your work in this space. And thank you to everyone for attending the Affirmation International Conference. And I hope everyone has a great rest of their day.
Bless all of you.
Amen.
Bless all of you.